How are we doing, Jane? Should I go for it? All right. And the recording and the live streaming is all supposedly working all right? Yeah? All right. Okay, folks, thanks for being here. I'm glad we could do this in person in ways that are COVID safe. I'm excited to see a bunch of people that I know here, and I hope that some people are watching online and will watch in the future. I'm a little tired today. I've got a 1-year-old at home, and my wife would tell you I get pretty nervous about these sorts of presentations, so I'm going to try to be coherent. I'm also a social worker. I'm not a professor of criminal justice. I am not a theologian. I am not a historian, although I am going to do a little bit of all those things here today. There isn't much that I'm going to say today that hasn't already been said, and often said much better by other scholars, and particularly by black women. So I'm going to commend to you, if you are interested in following up on today's presentation, the work of Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Dylan Rodriguez, Alex Vitale, Esau McCauley, and Aaron Griffith. If anyone wants to follow up on any of those authors, let me know. I've got a lot I want to do here, and I'm going to try to do it in the time that we have together. We'll see how that goes. I want to first go into Scripture. I'm a Reformed scholar teaching at Calvin College. We're going to go right to the Bible. We're going to talk a little theology. Then I want to do a deep dive on history. Where did the police come from? How did we get here? I want to look at some recent high-profile incidents, whether you want to call them police brutality, racist incidents, racial incidents, however you label them, in the city of Grand Rapids in the last 4 years. I had to confine it to just the last 4 years to limit what we could talk about. Then I want to briefly, at the very end, consider some possibilities for moving forward, including differences between reformist solutions, defunding solutions, and abolitionist positions. We'll see how we get there. I want to spend most of my time on a diagnosis today because I think we, and when I say we, I mean white people like myself, tend to want to rush to solutions, to fixing it without understanding the problem and the depth of the problem, and I think that's wrong. I think that's the wrong way to go. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to look at my notes a bit because I've got a lot of specific quotes. And let me state clearly here at the beginning, before I even advance the slide, that I'm not opposed to public safety. I have done work in nations without police forces and in nations with horribly corrupt and inept police forces. In places like Liberia, in places like Honduras, I have seen what happens when there is no protection for people who need protection. I am not against public safety. I do think we probably need some sort of body that is state authorized to use force to prevent violence and protect people. What I want to argue today is that that ought to be the last resort and that too often it has been the first resort. I want to argue that we should be ending a system that says it's about preventing crime but has too often been about control. Before I begin the presentation, if you would, briefly with me, observe a moment of silence for Breonna Taylor, who was born in the city of Grand Rapids when I was in 5th grade in June of 1993, and was killed too soon. So please join me in a moment of silence for Breonna and for all those unarmed black individuals killed by police. Thank you. For each of the last 5 years in the United States, roughly 1,000 people have been killed by the police every year. Roughly 100 police officers have been killed every year for the last 5 years. All of that is tragic. None of that is the desire of God, who desires that we have life and have it abundantly. Much of that is the result of guns. I do not have enough time to talk today about guns. But there are reasons why our nation has so much more death than other nations. And I would commend to you the work of my former colleague James Vanden Bosch, who taught in the English department here at Calvin University for many years, who describes himself as an expert in the grammar of the absolute phrase in the late 18th century, and who has argued, I think, quite persuasively that our current interpretation of the Second Amendment is dead wrong, even from an originalist grammatical standpoint. But we're not here to talk about guns, we're going to talk about the police. So, in our current environment, which is sort of hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan, I think there are attitudes about politics and the police. I do not want to equivocate at all between the Republican and Democratic parties as they're currently instituted in the United States on these issues, but neither party has done this well. And the history of both parties has deeply problematic rhetoric around police and around race. So you're looking at a graph, right, that shows that white folks who identify with the Democratic Party have made some progress from 2015, which is the gray line, to 2018, which is the green line, to 2020, which is the blue line. So there has been some shift in the Democratic white electorate on attitudes towards the killings of unarmed black men. In particular, there has been no shift in the Republican electorate, and that is led mainly by evangelicals, right, by Christians, like the people here at Calvin University. The attitudes are much less among unaffiliated, non-religious white folks of all parties. But again, that's not to say that this doesn't have issues on both sides of the aisle. I think we all know where the president stands on this. He's made that abundantly clear over and over again, and we'll return to that in a little bit. But Joe Biden has certainly done some similar things in the past, right? In May 1991, only 2 months after Rodney King was beaten in Los Angeles, Joe Biden introduced the Police Officers' Bill of Rights, which, among other protections, instituted protections against police investigation that I think ought to be rolled back. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he helped draft and pass the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, more properly called the Clinton Crime Bill. I have deep problems with that bill and its mandatory sentencing guidelines. So again, not to falsely equivocate, but to say that there are some real issues here. I am not trying to be partisan. I am going to be political. You can't not be political, but I am not attempting to be partisan here. I hope that distinction makes sense to folks. What I am trying to be is Christian. That should come as no surprise here at Calvin, right? And particularly to be a public Christian intellectual. Willie Jennings, who graduated from Calvin College when it was Calvin College, now is a theologian at Yale University, wrote a piece in 2015 that has become something of a guidepost for my own work as a Christian intellectual. He said that the work of a Christian intellectual today is to confront those powers, those principalities that continue to distort our Christianity. And then he says, allow me to name 3 powers that a Christian intellectual must confront. And he says, we must confront the principality of whiteness. We must confront the principalities of greed and violence. We must confront the principalities of fear. I think all of those are wrapped up in this debate about policing. To be a Christian intellectual, as Willie Jennings says, is to be an activist intellectual. So how do we think about this then as Christians? I grabbed these. I'm going to show you a variety of Facebook posts at different times during this presentation. I grabbed these from the local lodge of the Fraternal Order of Police, their Facebook page, and from the Grand Rapids Police Officers Association, which is the union, the police union in town. You can see the one there probably pretty clearly. This is why we're free. This is why we're safe. On the opposite side, you have one that says, the best illustration that can be made for what the thin blue line stands for, the separation between good and evil, peace and chaos. Now, I would submit to you that that is constitutionally preposterous in a republic. Those are people exercising their First Amendment right under the Constitution to protest. They are not agents of chaos. They are agents of justice. They are agents of change. But furthermore, as a Christian, I would submit to you that it's a deeply idolatrous claim. Both the claim about separating good and evil, the line of which runs through the human heart, as Calvinists would tell you, and you cannot separate them that way into good professions and bad professions, good people and bad people. But also the claim that freedom and safety can come through something like the police. As Christians, we would affirm that freedom and safety come only through the triune God, that we are free in as much as the truth sets us free, the truth of Jesus Christ, and that we are safe only as much as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death with the Lord who is our shepherd. So I have real problems with some of this rhetoric as a Christian. Again, I am sure there are people in this audience who are listening online who are going to perceive that as a political statement. It is a political statement. It is not a partisan statement. That is a faith-based statement for me. Unfortunately, the U.S. has a pretty bad track record of what I would call idolatrous content around the police. This was just a quick view over Amazon. And of course, you could find hipster study Bibles and all other sorts of other idolatrous content that is not really worth going into. I'm not going to say too much about this other than to commend to you the work of Kristen Kobes-Dubé in history. Her book, Jesus and John Wayne, I think does a really great job of unpacking the, I don't even know how to describe what that is, but that sort of content. I am much more interested in what the Bible has to say about anger, about rage, and about justice. This is an op-ed that the Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley, who works at Wheaton, wrote in the New York Times about what the Psalms, what the Bible has to say about black anger. I think the Bible has quite a lot to say about anger. I'm not sure the Bible has a lot to say about how to be the wife of a police officer in 2020, but it has a lot to say about injustice. Later in this video, I'm going to show some images. I'm not going to show videos of people being beaten by the police because I have come to see that as dehumanizing and wrong. I also think it's ineffective, right? It presumes that people do not agree with this because somehow they have not seen it. Somehow there is not proof that is sufficient to them. I think that's wrong too. Esau McCaulley in this piece says, visible evidence of black suffering is not new. We have photographs of lynchings. The screams of black voices, the smell of charred flesh was insufficient to mar the smiling posses gathered around the corpses. The videos are a reminder that the issue was never about a lack of evidence. They reveal the lengths to which those in power will go to avoid facing the truth. What is happening in those videos is a manifestation of systemic racism. I think he's right about that. This is not just about finding evidence of bad apples. This is about facing a hard truth about systemic racism in the United States, which is why we're doing this during Unlearned Week, right? That was also the focus of Michelle Lloyd Page, Reverend Dr. Michelle Lloyd Page, her focus of her chapel speech. For those of you who watch this, not speech, message, a sermon that she gave on Monday, right, on Jeremiah 6. Both parts of what Esau McCaulley just said are represented here, right? To whom shall I speak? See, their ears are closed. It was never about the evidence, right? From the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. We need to be serious about this because this is serious. And if Christians deny the severity of the crisis in which we are telling our black brothers and sisters, other brothers and sisters of color, peace, peace, and there is no peace, right? It is wrong. It's biblically wrong. The Bible has quite a lot to say about this, about systemic oppression. I'm not going to read all the way through that, but take a look. This is Exodus 1, right? This is Pharaoh. God cares deeply about systemic oppression, about enslavement. God cares about marginalized workers. God cares about the oppression of ethnic minorities. God cares about those who squeeze the poor for profit, those at the bottom of the empire, the downtrodden. The Bible talks about the downtrodden, which implies somebody is treading them down, right? These are not unfortunates. The language that Pharaoh is using here, right, in Exodus, if you read through that, is, I'll point out, some of the exact same language that the founding fathers of the United States used in the Declaration of Independence, right? They are terrified of the potential of slave revolts, right? They see what happens later in Haiti and around the world. They are terrified because in South Carolina, at the time when they are breaking free from England, there are more black people, more enslaved people than white people. What would happen if they outnumbered us and overtook us, right? The Declaration of Independence lists a variety of grievances that they have with King George, the last one of which is, he has excited domestic insurrectionists among us. That's a direct reference to slave revolts, right? And has endeavored to bring on us the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, right? So the Declaration of Independence has very similar language to this. And I think too often in the United States, we think of ourselves as Israel instead of Egypt. I think that's a mistake. I think it's just a mistake. All right. God cares about that. You see that in Exodus 3 when God reveals God's self for the first time at the burning bush. I told my wife I wasn't going to talk about it, but if you remember in Exodus 2, if you've read through Exodus, Moses goes up and kills a guy, right? He walks up, he sees a slave driver oppressing a fellow Israelite, and the Bible says he kills him and buries him in the sand, walks away. When God reveals God's self to Moses, you might expect him to say, Moses, I saw what you did to that man. He does not. God starts with, Moses, I have seen my people being oppressed, and I am concerned for their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. Now, that's not at all to condemn murder. I think murder is wrong, but Moses was a murderer. David was a murderer. We could have a whole separate discussion about crime and how we define crime and how we think about people who have committed crimes. I've taught in the Calvin Hanlon program with men who have killed other people. They are still created in the image of God. They are still worthy of engaging with. They are still wonderful people in many regards. All right. New Testament. I'm going to briefly talk about the New Testament, and then I'll hit a passage that some people probably want me to hit. The Bible is also very concerned about debt, right? Sometimes I think we rush past this because we spiritualize the New Testament, the Lord's Prayer, all the parables about debt. But debt in the New Testament was about imprisonment. It was about police. It was about the state. If you owed money to a rich person and you couldn't pay it back, they threw you in prison, right? This is over and over and over again in the parables. We should be concerned about that, right? That is not an ancient thing either, right? So if God cares about enslaved people, we're going to talk about slavery in a second. God also cares about debtors and about using law enforcement to enforce poor people's debt collection, right? There are, right now in the United States, almost 500,000 people who are in jail who have not been convicted of any crime. Some of them, not all of them, but a good portion of them are there because they cannot afford to pay cash bail, right? That is wrong. We should not have that system. That is this system that we have all the way back in the Bible. We need to get rid of that, right? But unfortunately, we still use law enforcement much in this same way. Not exclusively, but this is a part of what happens. Indeed, a Department of Justice report on Ferguson, you may remember after the killing of Mike Brown, found that Ferguson's law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than on public safety. This emphasis on revenue has compromised the institutional character of Ferguson's police department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing. They refused to raise taxes, so they squeezed it out of poor people using the police. It's unmistakable. Read the DOJ report. God hates this, right? God hates squeezing money out of poor people. Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, we could go on. People not convicted of crime, these are innocent people, right? The most famous example of this, you may be familiar with this name, is Khalif Browder, right? A 16-year-old who was accused of stealing a backpack in 2010 and then spent 3 years in Rikers Island because his family could not afford bail. He later killed himself, partially as a result of that experience. All right. Jesus is deeply concerned about this. In fact, it's at the center of one of the most misinterpreted passages in the Bible. I don't have time to talk about this as much as I want to, but the turn the other cheek, give them your cloak, right? What is Jesus actually talking about there? Jesus is not some just do to me whatever you want, I'm not going to resist. Jesus here is referencing something that is culturally strange to us today, but the theologian Walter Wink says that in Deuteronomy, right, if you owed somebody money, they could demand your outer garment as collateral on that loan. Maybe you don't remember that from Deuteronomy. But what's Jesus saying here then? If somebody comes to take your outer garment, which they had a right under Jewish law to demand as collateral for a loan, Jesus says, give them your cloak too. Now, this may not strike you this way. He's saying, get naked in front of them. Why is he saying that? Because in the Hebrew Scriptures, to be naked, the shame falls on the viewer. You maybe remember this in the story with Noah, right? Noah is naked, and it's not he who is ashamed, as it would be in our culture. It is his son who is supposed to be ashamed because he has seen him. So Walter Wink, some other theologians say, hey, when Jesus says, give them your cloak too, he says, if somebody comes and tries to take your money to collect on a loan that you can't pay back because you are a poor person, strip naked and shame them publicly. That's what he's talking about. All right. And then finally, on theology, I would be remiss if I didn't talk briefly about James Cone, Crossing the Lynching Tree, a book which totally reshaped my own faith in many ways, and I think is well worth your time reading. The essential truth here being that the cross is a type of lynching tree, and that in the lynching tree we see echoes of the cross, and that if we cannot see the cross in the lynching tree, it is because whiteness has corrupted our faith, right? Yeah. All right. Some people might have said, well, Kuilema, you didn't talk about Romans 13, right? Romans 13 says the Bible has authorized the state to do certain things. Yes, it says that, but you are largely misinterpreting that if you think that gives the police justification to kill people. I don't have time to go into this either, but I'm just going to recommend that you read Nick Walterstorff, who taught here at Calvin for many years before going to Yale, who says that we completely misunderstand this passage and what sort of authority God is actually granting governments. He talks about this in the context of South Africa, right? And says, of course, God did not say submit to apartheid South Africa. That's ridiculous. God did not institute that state. In fact, he says that if the government of South Africa was authorized to curb injustice and instead pursued it, that Christians have a duty to pray for the downfall of that state, right? So check that out. If you don't like Nick Walterstorff, King says the same thing in the letter from a Birmingham jail, right? There are just laws and unjust laws. Everything that Hitler did was legal, King says. And if you can't tell the difference between a just law and an unjust law, he groups you into a group he calls white moderates, who he becomes just totally frustrated with. All right, let's talk about the cops then. I'm going to try to move through this quickly, so stick with me. All right, so the question here, this is from Chandraya Kumanika, who teaches at Rutgers. Are the police broken? I think many of us would say there's something broken here. If so, when did they break, right? When did that happen? Many scholars argue, I think persuasively, that this institution was broken from the beginning, that there is no point when this was not broken, that largely this is functioning as it was intended to. It may have actually gotten better than what it was intended to do originally, but there is no point where suddenly it comes along, it started out great, and then it becomes broken, right? So what happened here? You may be familiar with this. This is a woodcut of slave patrols. You may have heard this argument before. But as the Harvard historian Jill Lepore says, why did American policing get so big so fast? The answer mainly is slavery. I think that's fairly true, fairly undeniable. There were voluntary night watches and other forms of proto-law enforcement in colonial America starting in the 1600s. but you don't really get a big organized force until the early 1700s, like the first slave patrol in Charleston in 1704. If that sounds like a leftist talking point, even the American Enterprise Institute, center-right think tank, has conceded that yes, policing in southern states has some roots in slave patrols. I think we can go a little further than that, but they concede the point. Now, they also passed, you may be familiar with, fugitive slave laws, which we see echoes of today, right? In 1793, in 1850, which deputize any free white person to police any black person, right? So you see somebody in, say, Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, and you suspect that they may be a slave, you have a right to detain them, right? You have an obligation to do that under fugitive slave laws. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, a historian at the Harvard Kennedy School, says perhaps the most revealing aspect of the way slave patrols functioned is that they were explicit in their design to empower the entire white population, not just with police power, but with the duty to police the comings and goings and movements of black people. The current narrative about Karens, or whatever you want to call it, has these same echoes, right? That white people still somehow feel entitled to police the comings and goings of black people, in echoes of fugitive slave laws. If slavery seems like ancient history to you, and I know that it does because I hear this all the time when I do anti-racism workshops, I'd like to introduce you to Dan Smith. Dan Smith lives in Washington, D.C., which, as a completely related side note, means he has no representation in the House or in the Senate. He is taxed without representation. Anyway, Dan Smith is the living son of a slave. His father, Abram Smith, was enslaved, born enslaved. His father had him when he was 70 years old. Dan Smith is now 88. That is a single generation from right now to slavery in the United States. Now, that's not a usual story, right? There's many generations for most of us, but the fact that that is still the case, I think, should tell you that this is not as far ago as you think that it is, right? His father was born into slavery. He is alive today. All right, so half of this is about slave patrols. I think I made that case at least a little bit here. I could go into it more. If you have questions, please ask me. The other half has to do with what I would call xenophobia, nativism, and classism, economic interests of capitalism. So if policing in the South emerges predominantly out of slave patrols, policing in the North emerges predominantly out of concerns about the economy, about protecting the interests of wealthy white landowners and business owners, and protecting them from particular labor unions, right? So this is the flag, if anyone knows, from the 1850s of a party called the Know Nothing Party. They were called the Know Nothing Party because if someone asked them about their beliefs, you were supposed to reply, I know nothing, sort of a Fight Clubby type thing. The Know Nothings were a flash-in-the-pan party. They only ran in one presidential election, but they were a radically nativist, xenophobic, I would say proto sort of Tea Party, QAnon type mashup, right? that sort of strain that's always been part of American politics. They ran particularly in the North, in Boston. Boston was the first city to have an organized police force in the North in 1838, expanded in 1854, 2 years after the Know Nothings swept local offices. So, the Know Nothings, yeah, you can't probably read that political cartoon, but at the bottom it says, what are you for as Know Nothings? We are for the protection of American mechanics against foreign pauper labor and carrying out the laws of the state as regarding sending back foreign paupers and criminals. So, the Know Nothings, they're very concerned about protecting Boston merchants, right, who are having trouble with strikebreakers, labor unions, don't want those folks around. Now, that's not to say race wasn't an issue there, because across the United States in the 1850s, we are not very concerned with the rights of black Americans. This is when Dred Scott comes down, right? They say that the white man, black people have no rights which a white man is bound to respect. They say that Dred Scott is property, not a citizen. This is 1857. 5 of those Supreme Court justices came from families that owned slaves. So we could talk about the Supreme Court if we wanted to. And then after the Civil War, you get the 13th Amendment. You've probably watched this. You can watch Ava DuVernay's excellent documentary. How many people have seen that? Right, so the 13th Amendment bans slavery except as punishment for crime, right? And very quickly, across the South then, this results in the criminalization of the black body, right? If we can't enslave you, then we can call you a criminal, and now we can treat you the exact same way. We can put you on chain gangs, plantations, sometimes the very same plantation they came from, and all we need to do is declare that you're a criminal, and that's pretty easy to do. We can declare unemployment, not having a job can be declared criminal. Vagrancy, literally just hanging out, is a crime. And if we catch you doing it, we can put you in a chain gang. We did this for everybody, down to children across the South, right? And then pseudoscientists, social scientists, the forebears of social work and sociology in America, looked at quote-unquote crime statistics from the South and said, look, black people are inherently criminal. Look at how much they're getting arrested. Now, why were they getting arrested? They were getting arrested so that they could be forced into labor, right? But we use those statistics to create and continue to build a narrative about inherent criminality that continues to this day through a variety of black code laws. You may have heard of Reconstruction. I'm moving fast because we got to get up to the 60s and to today. Reconstruction was that brief moment, I would say an ongoing project, where we were actually making progress on this after the Civil War. But it only lasted 12 years. During that 12 years, we had black members of Congress. We had black senators from southern states, from places like Mississippi. By 1901, there were no black members of Congress again. So Reconstruction briefly happens, and then it ends. I don't know how much you know about Reconstruction. I would say please look into it. It is probably the most important period in U.S. history for you to understand at this given time. Because again, it was unfinished business, and it is unfinished business because in the presidential election of 1876, the Republicans, who at that time were the anti-slavery party, right, party of Abraham Lincoln, traded the White House for the end of Reconstruction. They were in a very close presidential election. We have this thing called the Electoral College, which is also racist. And the Electoral College wasn't really working out. It was up in the air. It might have to go to the House of Representatives. They went into secret negotiations, and the Democrats in the South said, if you pull federal troops out of the South and let us govern ourselves again, we will give the Republican candidate the White House. So Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president. They withdraw federal troops from the South, and Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina become democratically controlled again, ending Reconstruction. Within 30 years, there are no black elected representatives. You have all the Jim Crow laws, and you have the rise of the Klan. All that because somebody wanted to be president. We're at Calvin, so I'm going to take a quick detour on Abraham Kuyper. If you don't know who Abraham Kuyper is, he's probably the single most influential theologian over this institution. In many ways, I always tell people we should be called Kuyper College, not Calvin College. Abraham Kuyper was a prime minister of the Netherlands and a theologian. He actually visited the United States during the end of this period in 1898. He was in this city in Grand Rapids. And he was deeply racist. Not in an exceptional way. It was just garden variety, average racism, but it's important to say that he was, right? We need to own that. This is a book he wrote about South Africa. And he's reflecting on his visit to the United States. And he says, don't imagine that just because they're Christian, they have given up their what he calls racial passions, right? He says, I met with black people in America, and they want to kill you. He concludes, between blacks and whites, there will never be lasting reconciliation. Thanks, Abraham Kuyper, for that. The incident he's referring to in Wilmington was a horrific incident where a white mob killed the black elected government of a city to seize power in a coup. Somehow Abraham Kuyper views this again as evidence of black criminality because that's how the media portrayed it. Okay. You're familiar with the history of lynching. I'm not going to go into that. Other than to say that at the highest level, Americans bought a completely false narrative about lynching, right? That was very much tied to, again, inherent black criminality. Here's Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive, a liberal, right? Saying the real cause of lynching is rape. No, that's wrong. Ida B. Wells, if you've ever done any reading of Ida B. Wells, said, no, that's completely wrong. No one believes what she called the threadbare lie that black men rape white women. She, in fact, put a whole book together of social science refuting it, a book called Southern Horrors. Now, at this very time, right, peak Klan, the KKK is out. We're showing Birth of a Nation, openly racist films in the White House, and policing is really getting rolling, right? Out in California, if you're from California, a guy named August Vollmer, who's a former U.S. military official, starts what we would call the first really modern police department with badges, uniforms, guns, modeled on the military, right? From the beginning, modern policing, this is 1909, has been modeled on the military. He served time in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War when the United States colonized the Philippines during our imperial phase. All right, now we're getting close to Grand Rapids. Here's a shot from 1911 of a furniture strike in Grand Rapids. There was a big strike. So I said slave patrols in the South, consumerism, classism in the North, right? Racism and capitalism. You see that here. This is the riot squad. Now, they don't have the gear that they have today, but this was the Grand Rapids Police Riot Squad in 1911 that responded to the strike. And why are they doing that? Again, who are they really benefiting there? They went in and beat up workers, Polish and Lithuanian furniture workers, on behalf of the white folks who owned those factories, right? The Dutch, by the way, broke this strike when the CRC said that people who were church members could not also be union members. It was not biblical. Talk more about that. That's Chicago, same time, around 1919. If you're from Chicago, a horrific incident, a guy named Eugene Williams, 17-year-old boy who went into the white area of water in Chicago. They had a segregated beach in Chicago. He drifted into the white part, was pulled out of the water and stoned to death on the beach by a white mob in Chicago, kicked off a massive uprising. I chose this photo just to show that, again, this was definitely about race. You have a veteran there, right? That's a World War I veteran, a man who fought in Europe to defend his country, facing off against a white National Guardman in Chicago, trying to assert his rights that he did not have in his own country. Okay, this is Grand Rapids again, 1925, Independence Day, July 4. That's the KKK marching through town. That's fairly explanatory. But again, to say that as we're developing modern police departments, we are a very racist nation. We have some real problems. And again, if this isn't, when the police broke, again, find the point for me when that happened. The KKK, by the way, a deeply Protestant, Christian, patriotic organization. It was really more of a civil society than anything else. It just happened to also engage in widespread terrorism. Now, we're getting very close. People who have had me in class know I can't not show a redlining map, so I got to have a redlining map in here. For those of you who don't know about this, I am here making a quick pivot to say that even, again, liberals like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, with the New Deal, created issues for black Americans. If you aren't familiar with redlining, take a class with me sometime or ask one of your peers. I don't have time to go into it. Suffice to say, the government created residential segregation in the United States. The government did that. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a result of individual racist people. The government did that through deliberate housing policy. So there's a redlining map from 1937. This is the city of Grand Rapids, sorted by race from census data in 2010. Right? The government did that. Now, if you know anything about crime, crime is most closely tied to poverty, right? So when the government does this, when between 1934 and 1968, 98% of government-backed mortgages go to white Americans, resulting in 70% of white Americans owning their home and less than 50% of black Americans, less than 50% of Latinx Americans, when the government does that and then turns around and enforces on people who are in poverty, you've got a system of control, right? That's about control. Here's LBJ talking about that. Again, maybe you think that Richard Nixon here, but LBJ had a rough time with this, right? He started a lot of these policies off. Now we're up to the time when you think about the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement was making progress, but right as that is happening, right as we're passing the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, we are also starting the beginning of the policies that lead us to where we are today. In 1965, he's passing policing acts. In 1968, it's literally the last piece of legislation that Lyndon Baines Johnson ever signs, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. He declared a war on crime in 1965. It was part of his Great Society, so there were many other good programs that came out of that: Medicaid, Medicare, early childhood education, good stuff. But unfortunately, over the years, we have stripped away almost all the Great Society programs that were about housing, about education, about jobs. And what did we keep? We kept the program about crime. And not only did we keep it, we expanded it over and over and over. But that does begin with Lyndon Johnson, right? Who is no saint on issues of race. What does that result in today? Today, in Grand Rapids, about 21% of residents live in poverty. 1 in 5 people, I'm talking about just the city, so that's about 200,000 people. I hope Calvin students know that 1 in 5 people who lives in this city that we are in right now is in poverty, right? If you look in certain black neighborhoods, it's as high as 47%. It's 1 in 2. In 2017, and I'm going to be careful with this just to make sure that the data holds, but in 2017, on the 50th anniversary of a riot in Grand Rapids, black poverty was worse in Grand Rapids than it was in 1967. Don't buy into a narrative that somehow time equals progress. It's not true. Effort equals progress. Work equals progress. Time is a guarantee of nothing. All right. I mentioned the riot. There's the riot in Grand Rapids, or a rebellion or an uprising, if you would prefer that language. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing about that. Ask yourself, why is that, right? This is about 53 years ago. Grand Rapids was in flames. Dozens of buildings burned down. Hundreds of people were arrested. The state police came in. This is the corner of Pleasant and Jefferson. It's about 2 blocks from my house. I walked my daughter to daycare down that street past that corner. We could talk about gentrification later. There's still a vacant lot where that building is burning. That's the corner of Buckley, right near Grace CRC. This was started after the cops pulled over a car full of young black men, one of whom had his arm in a cast, and they pulled him out of the car and beat them. People saw them beating a young man with his arm in a cast and started a riot, right? They were angry. They were upset. As well they should have been. There had just been an uprising in Detroit a couple days before in which people died, were killed. Mitt Romney's dad was the governor at this time, George Romney. A called in the National Guard, called in the state police, and put this down hard. You can watch documentaries. You can talk to people who were alive during this, right? There are many people in Grand Rapids today who lived through this and who were shot by the state police with shotguns, with handguns, right? They sustained injuries. No one died in Grand Rapids, but there are accounts of people being shot, and there are accounts of police chiefs going through black neighborhoods with machine guns, shooting out porch lights because they wanted to enforce a curfew in the entire southeast side of Grand Rapids. What does that do to long-term trust, right? Let's say your father, your grandfather was shot by the state police in '67. Why should you trust the police? I think that's an open question. And again, at the same time, we have a continuation of sort of openly racist political speech. That's George Wallace, who ran for president the next year in 1968, made this a huge part of his electoral campaign, right? He was a candidate for law and order. We'll talk a little bit about more law and order in a second. But he won 13% of the vote nationally. He got 45 electoral votes. He carried 5 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And he almost forced the Electoral College to go to the House of Representatives because Nixon squeaked over the line with 301 votes out of, you need 270, right? So that's George Wallace, who famously in 1963 declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Who ran for president in '68, got a lot of votes. At the time, Calvin College was down in the city. Some of you have taken class with me, have gone and walked past this building. It's still on Franklin Street. You can go check it out. We started leaving that campus the next year in 1968. Now, we were leaving that campus because we needed more space. We needed to come to this farm out here, the Knollcrest Farm, which was on the outskirts of the city. But again, it sent a message to the community in Grand Rapids about who we were and what we were committed to. We sold the remainder of that campus in the early 1970s and left the city for the edge of the city entirely. I could talk a lot more about Calvin College. Wallace was running against Nixon. They were both, if we're honest, running as law and order candidates. Hubert Humphrey was also in this election as the Democrat. If this seems like a long time ago, this was my dad's first election. He was 18 in 1968. So he was voting for this. And there were plenty of people at the time who were deeply suspicious about what was going on. If anyone's been to Urbana ever, InterVarsity, Christian folks, check out Tom Skinner. He gave a great speech at Urbana 1970 where he complained about Christians' complicity with law and order politics. He says this, "Make no bones about it, the difficulty in coming to grips with the evangelical message of Jesus Christ in the black community is the fact that most evangelicals in this country who say that Christ is the answer will also go back to their suburban communities and vote for law and order candidates who will keep the system the way that it is." That's 1970. That's 50 years ago. Somebody is saying, look, if you want to be taken seriously as a Christian, you need to stop this. I'm going to skip over it, but sometime you should read Richard Nixon's inauguration speech. It is dark. Contains some really disturbing lines, right? Yeah. We look at America, we see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night, right? We hear the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. They are not racists or sick. They are not guilty of the crime that plagues the land. They are good people. They are decent people. They work and they save and they pay their taxes and they care. Anyway, we could talk all about Richard Nixon's rhetoric about law and order. But his own aide, the man in the photo there with him, a guy named John Ehrlichman, says we knew we were lying about that at the time, right? That was just a political strategy. Here's the quote. You want to know what this is really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that, you had two enemies, the anti-war left and the black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So the war on drugs was always built as a political strategy, as a deliberate lie in the United States. And I just want to point out that the ramifications of that continue today. Grand Rapids just, we have recreational marijuana in this city, right? There are mostly white men who are going to make millions of dollars selling weed in the city, while there are mostly black men sitting in prison for selling marijuana in the city. What is that? What kind of system is that? I think we need to ask ourselves that repeatedly. How on earth could we legalize recreational marijuana and not even think about retroactively letting those men out of prison? It's unconscionable. All right. Law and order is still the big discourse, right? This is from yesterday. I think the president's taking too many steroids right now. He was on a real tear. There it is, right in the middle. Law and order, vote! Law and order is a dog whistle. The president knows that. The president is not stupid. The president knows what he is saying. He knows who he is saying it to. He is saying it to the same people Richard Nixon was saying it to the same people George Wallace was saying it to. All right, which brings us to Grand Rapids. Let's talk about Grand Rapids. You may have heard about this, but the big issue in Grand Rapids, I got till 5, right? Cool. I will try to leave some time for questions here. Grand Rapids, the big policy issue here is that we are locked in on our budget, all right? 32% of our budget has to, by law, be spent on the police. 1/3 of every dollar we pay into this city goes to the cops. Now, I think we probably, again, need some sort of force to protect ourselves. Do we need to be spending 1/3 of our money? Should we be spending 1/3 of our money on that? Is that the best way to spend our money if we are to talk about truly preventing crime? As a social worker, I don't think so. I think we ask our police officers to do too much. They cannot be mental health professionals, right? They cannot be experts in domestic violence, right? They cannot be EMTs, right? Who are, that we're asking them to respond to opioid overdoses, domestic violence, issues with children. We're asking them to be able to speak multiple languages because we have people speaking a variety of languages that are community. We're asking them to do too much. We probably need them to do certain things, but I do not think we need to spend 32% of our budget on it. So where did that number come from? That number came from 1995. So there's Michael Jordan, right? At the height of the Bulls dynasty. And here in Grand Rapids, the voters are asked to pass a resolution to get this in the books. At the time, we were spending 28% of our budget on the police in the city of Grand Rapids. And so they said, we're going to institute a new precinct system. There's going to be 32 precincts. We're going to spend 1% per precinct. 32 precincts. It's very nice, tidy math, right? 32%. It's 1995, and that 32%, that increase will pay for 95 more police officers, right? So it's the Safety 95 campaign. Now, again, let's just put this in historical context. This is Breonna Taylor is 2 years old, 1995. The Clinton crime bill passed in 1994. This is the height of the super predator narrative, right? We are terrified of young black men in the mid-90s. The show Cops is on every night. I know because I was in middle school and my father watched it every night. If you're watching Cops every day, if you're hearing politicians on both sides of the aisle talk about super predators and super killers, if we're putting in mandatory life sentences, sometimes for juveniles, right? It's pretty easy to get this passed, right? Here's an op-ed from the former mayor. More GR police means a safer city. Does it? I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. They passed this using what I would call some really dubious math. They put out flyers that made it seem like crime was going up everywhere in Grand Rapids, right? So if you look at that graphic, all those red areas where there are percentage increases in total incidents of crime and only a few areas where it's going down, and they took credit for it going down there. This was not true. Because if you dive into the stats, and a Calvin math professor, his name was Jim Bradley, actually wrote in the Grand Rapids Press that they were lying about the stats at the time. So kudos to Calvin on this one. Because if the majority of the crimes are happening in those areas, the vast majority, even if they're going down slightly, that outweighs all the rest of it, right? We can talk more about that. I've got colleagues who are better at stats than I am. But the Grand Rapids Press called it on them too. Crime drops as the city asks for more police, right? This actually was never about increasing crime, even though they pitched it that way. People also felt relatively safe. This was a poll, non-representative poll, but they took a poll of 1,000 people in the city. That's 1 in every 200 people. It's a pretty decent sample. And the majority of people said they felt pretty safe, at least acceptable, right? But again, the narrative here was that you should be afraid. This is the mid-90s. This passed in a special election with less than 19% of eligible voters voting. So 1 in 5 voters comes out to the poll. You probably have a good idea who those reliable voters are, tend to be older and disproportionately white, and they pass it. And now we are stuck here, right? 25 years later, with this locked in by law to our budget. We're going to have to open up the city charter, which is a dangerous thing to do, to even touch this. Now, I'll point out that right now, we are spending 39% of our budget on the police. We are spending more than we're even required to under a line that I think is already artificially high. And we are being told, like they were in 1995, that we have to do that or we will not be safe, right? And again, as Christians, I think we have to ask ourselves whether that is true, right? Again, at the time, the black community was very suspicious about this. I always want to include these side notes from Tom Skinner from these op-eds because there is always resistance, right? There is always resistance. And I think it's important and encouraging to look at it. This was a cartoon in a local black paper. You can see a bunch of white cops stomping on a black man who's in a pool of blood. Is this really why the city wants more officers? They're asking at the time in 1995. You can't read the fine print there, but let me read it for you. Ask yourself the following questions about the increase of police officers. Will the increase improve the rundown condition of our communities? No. Will the increase eliminate slumlords? No. Will the increase provide continued education and employment for our youth and adults? No. Will it eliminate youth gangs? No. Will the increase prevent corporate America from taking their profits out of our communities and into the suburbs? No. Or will there be an invisible fence like a net that will control our adult citizens and youths, especially African Americans? Yes. Will police control the movement of our citizens in the core city? Yes. So people knew this at the time. Again, I said that they were lying about crime. Let me back that up. These are the national statistics on violent crime. Violent crime has been going down for virtually your entire lifetime. Maybe those of you who have been watching a lot of YouTube videos, maybe from certain organizations, would say that the murder rate is going up, and that's true. Homicide rate in certain large major cities is going up, and that's something we need to work on, right? But overall, violent crime has been decreasing for decades and is far down from levels that it once was. That's true nationally, that's true in Michigan, that's true in Grand Rapids. This is a graph from 1985 to 2019 of violent crime, right? Now, most people don't know that is the problem. The majority of people, particularly Republicans, but all people, think that crime is going up. Year after year, you ask Americans, is crime going down or going up? And they say up every year. You can look back at 30 years of Gallup data on this, and every year, more than 50% of Americans say they believe there is more crime this year than the last year, despite that being untrue for at least 3 decades. When we talk about the truth setting us free as Christians, this is what we talk about, right? We need to know the truth about these things. You also know what happens when you get all these people into this system, right? You get mass incarceration. If you are opposed to mass incarceration, if you came in here today a little unsure about what I was going to say about the police, consider what the implications are, right? I don't think you can be opposed to mass incarceration if you're not willing to work on what puts people into the top of that funnel. Michigan there stands out not just internationally, right? That's Michigan's incarceration rate in orange. Below us is the United Kingdom, Portugal, Luxembourg, Canada. We imprison a tremendous number of people. 1 in 3 black men in the United States, you've probably heard this statistic, is likely to be incarcerated, especially those born after 2001 at some point in his life. Now, again, either that's as a result of systemic racism or you really believe that black men in some way are inherently violent. I think those are your options, and you need to decide for yourself which is true. I think that's a result of systemic racism. I'm going to put my cards on the table. We also have a tremendous amount of people under probation, which has been going up. I won't talk too much about that, but Michigan is right up there between Texas and Louisiana, far above the national average at the bottom for the sheer number of people we have under some form of control. That's prisons, jails, probation, and parole, right? All put together. All right, now probably the most controversial part of the presentation, I want to talk about some of the incidents that have happened in Grand Rapids. So I gave you a biblical theological case, right? I talked about the history of where I think policing emerges from. Now I have to talk to you about some of the things that I think have gone wrong with this. And again, I'm limiting this to just the last 4 years. And we're going to start right here at Calvin with Lee Swafford. Lee Swafford worked for 22 years on the Grand Rapids Police Department before becoming a campus safety officer. On Thanksgiving break in 2016, he confronted an individual on this campus and pulled his gun on that person. Later, William Corner, who's still head of campus safety here, while reviewing routine body camera footage, came across footage of the incident between Swafford and the individual and fired him. He was also charged with a misdemeanor for reckless use of a firearm. He first pled not guilty to that, later pled guilty to it, and was sentenced to a misdemeanor. You probably weren't students in 2016, but this is not that long ago. When I started working here in 2008, our officers did not carry guns. I was opposed to them carrying guns for reasons like this. Now, they carry guns to prevent school shooters, and again, we're back to the larger issue of guns. But anyway, they have guns, and they've used them recklessly, right? So again, if this is about bad apples, wouldn't Calvin University be the sort of place that could guarantee the good cops? I would like to think so. I think this speaks again to a broken system of training people about how they interact with people. At the time this incident came out, President Leroy said that anyone who had questions or concerns should contact Sarah Visser or Michelle Lloyd Page, the Executive Associate for Diversity and Inclusion. I sent the president an email asking him if he could disclose the racial or ethnic identity of this individual, because for me, the inclusion of Michelle Lloyd Page there raised questions about that individual's identity. Calvin has refused to identify that information and refused to release the tapes, the body camera tapes of that incident. That may be a defensible decision, but I do not think it personally builds trust. All right. Here's a study. This is from 2017. So that was 2016. We're in 2017. Some Calvin students participated as data collectors in this study. So I can speak to the quality of the study. They were graduates of our department, sociology and social work graduates. A study by Lamberth Consulting, major firm, found that if you're black in Grand Rapids, you're twice as likely to get pulled over, right? They monitored multiple intersections for months. This was a rigorous study. If you have questions about the methodology, I would be happy to defend it. There's racial profiling in the city. The GRPD racially profiles drivers. I think we can say that pretty clearly. At the time, the city manager said, the findings from the traffic stop are very troubling. We do not shy away from these disappointing findings. We own this, but they have not really done anything about it. Also 2016, going back a year. November, this is on Union, right off of Fulton. Josh Kuiper, who was at that time the assistant Kent County prosecutor, is driving drunk the wrong way up a one-way street. He runs into a parked car, which hits a pedestrian, injuring the pedestrian, totaling the car. He is pulled over by some GRPD who recognize who he is, that he is the Kent County Assistant Prosecutor, and they cover it up. I am not overstating that in any way. There are about 16 minutes of audio files between the two officers, Officer Warwick and Officer Ickes, who remain on the force, calling to headquarters, being put onto what they thought was an unrecorded line, and talking very openly about how they will cover this up. They acknowledge that Josh Kuiper is hammered. They report that he is effed up, that he cannot pass the tests. The person at HQ says, can we get him to pass the tests? Go listen to the audio for yourself. In fact, Lieutenant Janisky, who's at HQ, his wife was working in the prosecutor's office. They talk about what will happen when Monica, his wife, digs into this case, and he tells her that she won't because I'll effing tell her not to. Now, Josh Kuiper was clearly intoxicated, and he should have faced charges for this. He did not. The police chose to cover it up, and because they are members of a police union, and unions are one of the things I would identify that need to go for cops or be heavily reformed, he was protected, and those officers kept their jobs. Janisky was fired, the guy at HQ, but the other two are still on the force. 2017, March. GRPD pull over 5 young black boys between the ages of 12 and 14 at gunpoint, forcing them onto the ground. Again, I'm not going to play this audio, but it has been viewed on YouTube more than 750,000 times. The boys cry. They clearly believe that they may die. The officers show very little empathy for them. I cannot imagine that happening to my niece, who is 11 years old. It never would. It never would. Why? Why is that, right? This is also 2017, December. Honesty Hodges, 11-year-old black girl who is handcuffed by the police who are responding to a stabbing call. She, who is black and 11 years old, bore no resemblance to the suspect, who was an adult white woman who did not live at the address Honesty was at. But because Honesty was not cooperating with the officers at the time, they placed an 11-year-old girl, who they later claimed looked over 18 to them, into handcuffs. The peer-reviewed literature would tell us that officers routinely overestimate the age of young black children. This is what happened with Tamir Rice. This is what happens with Trayvon Martin. People routinely overestimate their age, their physical size, their aggression. Happens here in Grand Rapids. I've been saying this for years, and it remains true. Grand Rapids is always this close to becoming the next Ferguson, the next Kenosha. It could happen at any moment. All of the conditions that exist in those cities, the historical oppression, the redlining, the riots, it all exists here in Grand Rapids. The only thing missing is the match, right? And we need to reckon with that as a community. We need to try to stop that before that happens. The police chief at the time, David Rahinsky, said, listening to the 11-year-old's response makes my stomach turn. It makes me physically nauseous. Now, you would think that would mean things would get done, but again, the police chief, who is appointed by the city commission, does not have as much power over officers' discipline as the police department themselves, and particularly as the officers' union. They police themselves. The police police themselves through internal affairs. And if they decide nothing needs to change, nothing is going to change. In fact, in this case, with Honesty Hodges, the officers' union came out again on Facebook saying the men and women of the Grand Rapids Police Officers Association are nauseated at how the chief handled this. His statements in the news have caused unrepairable damage. He can no longer be trusted. This was the beginning of the end for Chief David Rahinsky. He lost the officers. The officers became actively opposed to him after this time, the officers' union. He also wanted to fire Warwick and Ickes after the cover-up, and the officers' union said no, and so they weren't fired. 2018, twin 11-year-old black boys pulled over by the cops. I'm not going to go into that one. This is 2018, November. Hilmar Ramos Gomez. Hilmar Ramos Gomez is a U.S. citizen, born in Grand Rapids, served in the Marine Corps, saw combat in Afghanistan, suffers from PTSD. Ramos Gomez was detained on the roof of Butterworth Hospital downtown for acting erratically. He was in the middle of what I would call a post-traumatic stress incident, right? Again, this should have been a mental health call. There was no need for the police officer to be there. He set a fire in a trash can, which the police later tried to claim was evidence of domestic terrorism. He was detained by the GRPD, spent several weeks in jail because his family could not afford bail, and then was sent, despite being a U.S. citizen, to an ICE detention facility, an Immigration Customs Enforcement facility, because he was racially profiled by an on-duty police lieutenant, an off-duty police lieutenant. This is a still from the body cam footage of his arrest. They are holding his U.S. passport. There was no excuse here. This was clearly a U.S. citizen. Again, he had his passport on his person. Why? Because he needed to. Because as a Latinx person in Grand Rapids, he knew he needed to. But this man, Kurt Vanderkoy, one time, anyway, I won't get to that. Kurt Vanderkoy saw him on the television. He wasn't even working, he was at home. He saw this man on the television. He said, that guy looks like an illegal to himself. He called him actually the Spectrum Helipad Loco, or crazy, right, in emails. He said, I want to run a check on this guy, and he sent him to an ICE detention facility. Now, that's both racial profiling, complete corruption, and just incompetence, because they knew he was a U.S. citizen. They had his passport in their possession. And yet he spent time in jail because he couldn't afford bail, and he spent time in an ICE detention facility because of their incompetence and their racism. They settled that for $190,000. In the 90s, GRPD settled a lawsuit for $2.6 million, but that lawsuit was for reverse discrimination against white cops. 8 white cops got $2.6 million for being discriminated against because the GRPD was trying to hire more minority and female officers. He got $190,000 25 years later. Bronquell Brown, $125,000 settlement in this, and the officer was fired in this incident. Bronquell Brown, this is March of 2019. He was pulled over, traffic stop. He had outstanding warrants. I'm not going to deny that. That doesn't mean any of this is justified. You can watch this video again. I don't feel the need to. The officer became enraged at him when he would not get out of his car. He would not get out of his car in part because his 2-year-old son was in the car with him and he was terrified. The officer shattered the window with his flashlight, maced him through the open window, pulled him out through the window, and after he was handcuffed, hit him 29 times. $125,000 settlement. However, despite the fact that the officer was fired, he will face no criminal charges because the Kent County prosecutor, the man who took Josh Kuiper's job, said he didn't believe his office could prove an assault and battery charge, and there's no legal charge for excessive force. It just doesn't exist. Here's 2019. Headline speaks for itself. And then finally, a return to this incident, the cover-up that I mentioned. So now we're talking May 2019. Despite a pending Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, from the ACLU to the GRPD and to the city of Grand Rapids, a federal judge ruled on May 24, 2019, that the city did not violate Janisky, the guy who got fired, the guy who said, "Call me back on the unrecorded line," right? And we'll talk about it there. They fired that guy, and he said, "I shouldn't have gotten fired," so he sued them, which is just the height of hubris. A federal judge said, "No, that doesn't count." And the next Monday, the next business day on Monday, the city of Grand Rapids hired a private IT contractor and purged the entire line, all the recordings. They had a pending Freedom of Information request from the ACLU. They knew people wanted the audio from that line. We will never know what was on that line and how many times they had used it to coordinate corruption. We will never know because they purged it. When Warwick calls Janisky, he starts talking about it, and Janisky interrupts him and says, "Stop talking, 3407. The first recording is, "You need to put this number in your cell phone so that you call me on this number." So this is not the first time they had done this, right? The city has refused to comment about why they did this. An email from a private IT contractor emailed the city's IT director on Monday, May 27, 3407 recordings are gone. Check them today. They have been purged. All right. Now, this is what troubles me, right? You have an institution with a troubled history, with a history of very recent trouble, and they still resist any calls for accountability or reform, right? This is from last week, from the local lodge. They're a highly partisan entity. They've made no bones about that. Here's some posts from their page. There's a lot of Turning Point USA stuff, a lot of PragerU stuff, a lot of Donald Trump videos. They're not trying to hide their political affiliations as a union. Does that mean all GRPD officers have those political leanings? No, it does not. But it does mean that those who are involved in the union and the Officers Association very much do, right? 83% of these individuals do not live in the city of Grand Rapids. They only come here to work. They don't live here. Only 17% of them live here. That has gone down in the last several decades. In the 90s, it was 25%. They continue to be vocally opposed to defunding and to call for people to help defend them from defunding. The force is 90% white, 4% black. The city is 68% white, 19% black. And then, in a move that really upset me, last year they named Thomas Warwick, one of the officers involved in the cover-up of Josh Kuiper, Officer of the Year. This was done by the union, and it was done, in my estimation, as a deliberate provocation to the chief and to the city to say, we don't care. We have the power here, we know we have the power here, and we don't care. Finally, one final incident recently over the summer. You may have seen this on Twitter or YouTube or Reddit. It's been viewed, at least on Twitter, 5.5 million times. There was a guy downtown who got shot with a speed heat canister at close range. Anybody see this video? All right. Now, the officer thought that he had the bottom thing in there, muzzle blast, which is like a burst of air, but he had a pepper spray tear gas canister in there. A munition which, by the way, is banned under international conventions of war, but continues to be used domestically against our own citizens. Now, so he was, again, incompetent. He thought he had one thing in there, he had the other, which is why it didn't just shoot a big puff of air and noise, it shot him with a physical grenade in the shoulder. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. They released a statement. You may recognize Monica Janisky, Lieutenant Janisky's wife there at the top. And even if they had wanted to charge that officer with something, you just can't. He's completely legally protected. I'm going to read you the law here. This is MCLA 750.527, which is titled, Death Ensuing from Efforts to Disperse Unlawful Assemblies or Riots. The statute states that if individuals have refused to disperse during a riot or unlawful assembly, and any such person or any other person there present as spectators or otherwise shall be killed or wounded, the said magistrates and officers and all persons assisting by their order or under their direction shall be held guiltless and fully justified in law. If that was a little legal for you, that means he could have walked up to that guy and shot him in the face and killed him, and we could have done nothing about it. Once the police declared that it was a riot, they can legally kill you, they can legally kill spectators. It doesn't matter. Again, I don't think that's keeping our community safe, especially when they're putting out memes calling protesters agents of chaos and evil people. That makes me very nervous. I've seen Calvin students at protests, right? Be careful. If they injure you, if they kill you, they will not be held accountable. I know that's difficult for some of you to believe that we live in a society where that's true, but you need to know that it is true. And that many people in our nation have known that to be true for a long time, right? All right. Then finally, militarization. This is all part of a ramping up of the militarization of our police. That's the National Guard downtown this summer. I'm not sure why we need to do that to our own citizens in our own country. I don't particularly think that speaks well of democracy. This is from April 2019. This is now the property of the police department in Cadillac, Michigan. Anyone from northern Michigan? Cadillac is a city with 10,000 people. Why does it need an MRAP, a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier? It doesn't. It doesn't need that. Why does it have that? Because of a Department of Justice program, 1033, which has funneled $7 billion worth of military industrial complex surplus to police departments. This is about greed. This is about greed. All right. So finally, I won't go over this, but in case you're wondering, there are differences between these positions. I've got 2 slides on this. A lot of people pursue reforms like body cameras or community policing or more training, right? You know what Kurt Vanderkooy got? Kurt Vanderkooy got a 20-hour suspension and had to go through diversity and inclusion trainings. Do I believe that will change him at all? No. So when people talk about wanting to do more trainings, you're just putting more money into the system. People who say we don't need to reform, we need to defund, are saying we really only want to pursue actions that are going to take money out of this system, that are going to decrease the size of this system. I, for one, really believed in body cameras. I spoke in front of the city commission when Grand Rapids was considering body cameras. I said you should do this. I'm not so sure that's true, because when it really comes down to it, they're often not turned on, or they lost the files. Or even if it's right there on tape, it doesn't matter because what they're doing is totally legal, right? So I'm not convinced that we need to give them more money for new technology. I'm not convinced that makes us safer. The sorts of things I would like to see are some of the things on this, right? Suspend the use of paid administrative leave. When a cop does something really terrible, put him on unpaid leave. Don't keep paying him. Withhold pensions. If a cop does something terrible, kills somebody, even if you can't prosecute them under the law, you don't have to pay their retirement for the rest of their lives. That's our taxpayer dollars. Require cops to be liable for misconduct settlements. Why is the city on the hook for $90,000 or $125,000 or $2.6 million and not the individual police officers? I get why that's true, and we could talk about that, but they should be at least somewhat liable. Withdraw all participation in military surplus programs. I do not feel safer when my police have more and more AR-15s, more and more chemical weapons, more and more armored personnel carriers. It does not make me personally feel safer. And the big one, reduce the size of the police. In 1995, we increased the size of the police. That's not set in stone. As Christians, part of prophetic critique is prophetic imagination. Can we imagine doing this differently, right? I think we can. I'm a social worker, right? I think we can decrease crime in other ways. We can treat mental health. We can work on affordable housing. We can do these things. These would help, but we need money to do them. And I think the money should come out of here. At the end of the day, that's what it is, right? For many years, I worked in military organizing around war, and I said, we need less money on national defense. I'm not convinced this keeps our nation safer. I'm not sure why it took me so long to apply that same logic to the police, but that's where I'm at, right? All right. That's my final slide. That's from a CRC report after the riot in '67, right? We need to learn how to live together, again, as a teaching of the gospel. The problem, as they conclude there, is that there is so little evidence in our society that Christians and their churches are willing to practice the plain and central teachings of their faith in regards to their neighbor. So let's try to love our neighbors. I think we can do that better in other ways. That's all I got. I did not leave myself any time for questions, Jane, but I will stick around. If you want to leave now. I'll give you a couple seconds. I'll stick around if anyone wants to ask questions, but I want to make sure people can leave if they need to leave. Thank you so much for coming. It really helps to have a live audience. It was great.